And we have Liz Benjamin here, who is going to be our moderator. And we're very happy to have her, to say the least. And so I look forward to another very interesting panel. Thanks.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm not Susan Arbetter, just so you know. She is a very good friend, asked me at the very last minute she had a family-related emergency and asked me to step in, and I was pleased to do so. This is a really interesting and important conversation, and I'm struck by the fact that it means a lot to me from a foundational standpoint because my dad, who some of you probably know, Dr. Jerry Benjamin, who is an expert in New York State government, but also was the Dean of Arts and Sciences at SUNY New Paltz for many years, instilled in me a sense of importance related to civics because he was also elected official at the local level for many years. So I grew up hanging out on election night when they still did the boards and people ran results back from the Board of Elections. And I understood that process pretty significantly and the importance of understanding how government works. That's where I got that education, and so it was unique for me, and that's something that's afforded to many people. So this is a really great opportunity, and I'm just going to very briefly introduce the panel that we have here of esteemed experts. All of their information can be found in your program and also online. If I went through all of their bios, we'd still be here later this afternoon, so I'm not going to tell everybody all of their accolades. We have with us, I'll start from my right, Nicholas DeMuro. Did I say that right, sir? Instructional Coordinator at the Genesee Valley BOCES. And then Commissioner Dr. Betty Rosa, who is Commissioner of Education at the President of the University of the State of New York, and that's at the State Ed Department. And then next to her, we have Dr. Lester Young, Jr., who is Chancellor of the Board of Regents, State Senator Shelley B, who's Chair of the Education Committee in the Senate, and then last, Dr. Jonathan E. Collins, who's Associate Director for the Center of Educational Equity Teachers College at Columbia, which puts you in a very interesting position, sir. So I think when we talked or heard from the last panel, they sort of set the stage at the federal level. Also, I heard a lot of sort of mandates and challenges for the state, not the least of which was give us more money, which I'm sure the senator has some thoughts about. And also, Chris Rayano, I did hear, Christopher, your thoughts related to the computer that runs the mysterious education aid formula. So I think there's going to be some thoughts about that too. But I'd like to sort of start by, we've sort of had the macro view, and now we're going to bring it down to a more micro view. And just start, if you would, and unfortunately, Mr. DeMuro has the unfortunate experience of sitting closest to me, so he gets to start, of where you think we are right now in New York from a civics education standpoint. Let's set the table.
Right now in New York State, with pertaining to civic education, I think that we are in a ascending place. I don't think that we're necessarily in the best place possible if you look at some other states around us, like Massachusetts, for instance. I think we're on the way up, though. The Blue Ribbon Commission has some very exciting things coming out, and in June we're going to hear more on that. But I do think that we are headed in the right direction. The Seal of Civic Readiness was a real shot in the arm for social studies education in the state. I taught for 10 years in a small rural district called Holly, New York, in Orleans County on the west side of Rochester. We're talking 60 kids graduating in a class per year. I was that football coach, social studies teacher. Teaching 6 classes, not one, and teacher first, coach second. I would say that in New York State, like I said, I'm hopeful and I'm cautiously optimistic as to where we're headed. There are bright days ahead for civic education if we're willing to throw our weight behind it. The Seal of Civic Readiness was one of 2 seals that, if the diploma requirements head in the direction as the Blue Ribbon Commission recommends, the seal was civic readiness was kind of a test tube, if you will, to what project-based and performance-based learning can look like. However, I'll speak more to it later, we do have to reckon with the fact that compared to our other content areas of math, ELA, and science, students in social studies are only tested twice in New York State, and we're not checking in with them until 10th grade. Whereas, math is up to, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's something like 7. Those 3 through 8 tests, when I'm getting calls, my job at BOCES is to assist districts with curriculum and school improvement. The other coordinators, the math and the ELA, please come help us with our test scores. There's that hyper focus around that and that concern, and civics gets left out as a result. So, but it's hopeful.
I think that's also, Commissioner, if you just also expand on that and talk a little bit, not just about sort of where we are, but where we might be going, but also, I mean, I spoke during the break briefly with several folks, and we were talking a little bit about, you know, teachers they're down to the minute, know what they have to be teaching to, because they're teaching to a test to ensure that their kids are going to be able to move on, and they'll be able to graduate, and they'll be able to get a job, and they'll be able to be successful in all the things that we want them to do. And so how do we ensure that we instill this sort of civics into that formula and that equation? And when we know also that the power of civics actually, as you heard the former panel say, particularly at the end when Chris Rihanna was talking a little bit about how people engage with each other, perhaps has the power to address bigger problems like bullying, for example, if people could just figure out how to engage with one another and not just, you know, hate on one another. So how do we make sure that civics is part of the formula as we go forward?
Sure. So let me start by saying that I'm not an isolationist in the sense of teaching. I think teaching needs to be incorporated so that it's part of, you know, when you think about civic, it should not be an isolated teaching process, but rather be part of the fabric, the total fabric. It should be part of the math, the English, every single part of the student's life should be civility. When you think about issues of equity, when you think about inclusivity, when you think about teaching students a sense of fairness, empathy, all of these amazing lessons that are part of civility and civics should really be incorporated every single minute and every single part of instruction. So I think a lot of times, you know, we tend to isolate these topics in separate ways, but rather if you think about the intersections, if you think about being very intentional in teaching this as part of the holistic approach, I think you really end up in a better place. I do think that I do want to give what I call data points, because I do think these are important. We did establish, the Regents and the department established a task force in 2018 through 2020. This is a document that is public, and we're more than glad to share, which is the New York State Seal of Civic Readiness Handbook. It is an amazing, amazing document that we have produced. Along with that, we have produced civic knowledge, civic skill actions, civic mindsets, civic experiences. That is all part of that work. So let me give you data points. The Seal of Civic Readiness is in its second year of full implementation. A lot of work, pre-work went into this. Last year we had 14,679 students across New York State earn the Seal of Civic Readiness. Now, again, we are in a trajectory to have that number really, this graduating class will have a larger number than that. In addition, we have over 500 schools across the state and others constantly joining to be part of this process. This process is not only the issue of students' participation, project-based, capstone project, but also a sense of volunteerism, looking at issues, as we talked about already, about some of these amazing lessons that we want our students to have as a sense of belonging in school, as a sense of empathy, compassion, all of these amazing issues that we want to make sure that our students have, particularly the issue that we talked earlier today about student voices. This process allows our students not only to become critical thinkers, to also know and empower them with the objectivity of knowing as they deal in media, understanding dissecting it and understanding how to be critical about what's being presented and the truth or the incomplete, or the single story that sometimes is presented.
So what's interesting, though, is when we talk, that you just heard the commissioner talk about the need to sort of have a holistic approach to civics, in so much as we incorporate it into sort of everything we do, this underlying concept related to how we engage with one another civilly, and also how we engage with our community and the greater democracy from a civics standpoint. So, Chancellor, if you would sort of expand on that, because again, we get back to what's taught in the classroom from a curriculum standpoint. Are we talking about self-governance? Are we talking about the founding of our democracy? Are we talking about what is it exactly, the three branches of government, et cetera? I mean, I think this sort of thing is definitely taught. And then there's an expanded, clearly, area related to civic engagement. And you know, I don't think we can have this discussion really, particularly in New York in the moment that we're at, without talking about civic engagement that I think that students on college campuses feel like they're engaging in right now. They feel like they're engaging in small d democracy. But then, of course, you know, what does that mean, and what should it look like? And apparently we're pretty divided on that. But let's start with, you know, what does it mean to teach civics?
Yeah. And thank you for that question. I would like to start with, I believe that right now we are in what I would describe as an incredible moral moment. And I say that because what we do right now will actually determine what happens to generations of young people that are just starting their educations now. And it's critically important that our young people have access to the knowledge, skills, and what's, I guess, most significant about civic engagement and civic readiness is that it's not just about knowledge and skills, because it recognizes that what's also important, and what might be more important, what young people are like, right? Because what you're like as a person really determines what you do with what you know. And so there is this emphasis on both on actions, on mindsets, as well as experiences. And so it's our hope that through the SEAL, and I would also say there's an expectation when the commissioner says that it should be taught in all content areas. From a board's perspective, from a policy perspective, we have an expectation that young people are being exposed to the knowledge, skills, actions, mindsets, and experiences pre-K through grade 12. So it's not just the high school activity, that it goes on throughout their education experience, so that when they complete their 12th grade education, they're armed with what they need to be successful at the next level. And that's critically important.
It sort of strikes me also, since we're sitting here in the Bar Center, you know, mock trial is also a form of civic engagement, something I actually did in high school and found enormously fun, mostly because I like to argue with people, which I also did for 20 years as a reporter. But that's another example that strikes me as we're having this conversation about areas where perhaps it's not obvious or necessarily woven into the curriculum, but is offered as an extracurricular activity in addition to supplement what's happening in the classroom. Senator Mayor gets to be sort of put on the spot, and so this is an all lovely, high-minded conversation, and now how's the rubber going to hit the road in terms of how are we going to afford it? But also in the former panel, there were a number of bills that were mentioned sort of floating around. So I guess let's start from your standpoint as education chair. I mean, what is the role of the legislature here?
Well, I think that my colleagues and I think of it sort of in a different way. Sort of there's three components. There's existing law in New York, 801A of the education law, which requires that there's instruction, civility, citizenship, and character education all the way from, as you said, K through 12. It's not, that's sort of an overall thing. And then on top of that, we have the CFE decision, which said a sound basic education, according to the Court of Appeals, also includes the ability to productively engage in our democracy. And I think my colleagues and I in the Senate Democratic majority particularly feel like that has to have meaning too. So it can't just be you took a class in school. It has to be that you are able to understand what our responsibility is as members of this democracy. And that includes voting, which I'm going to talk about because that's very much part of our thinking. And the third is that there's an element of the community civic engagement in the education space that we believe is very important. So you mentioned mock trials, for example. There's a whole range of things that we have legislated on, which is no easy feat. Let me just say that. People should not misunderstand that because, you know, we all support greater civics in school, that it's easy to get these bills passed. Many of you have worked with me on that. But we are doing things to encourage the ability to pre-register for 16 and 17-year-olds, to pre-register to vote. We changed that. The ability to force schools to allow pre-registration in schools, which used to be really segregated largely for affluent districts. We have a bill that we passed to require every school to have student government as an opportunity for students to learn leadership skills. And we encourage schools, like many that I know, to engage in this sort of community civics participation as high school or lower students to learn about their communities. And of course, we do fight about money. Right now, for the last 3 years, we've fought about getting foundation aid, and we really that was our fight. Now, I'm happy to say, together with State Ed and with the governor's office and with my colleagues and certainly with the litigants, we're able to get that money. Now we have to figure out how to productively move money into civics education. But I don't think we should have blinders on that we're just looking for people to teach civics. We perceive it, I think, as elected officials, as a much broader conversation. We want students to engage in their community. We want them to talk about electoral politics. We want them to know about issues that are relevant in their hometown, in their city. So we are trying to go at it from a range of perspectives. It has not been easy. We don't have control over curriculum, which is frequently perceived that we do in the legislature. That is a local matter in New York. So we're coming at it from many angles, but I agree with the opening. We are on the ascendancy, in part because we have a commissioner and a chancellor who are committed to this issue. We have majorities in both houses and a governor who believes this is essential, and we have to reorient to it. I would say I've gone to AP government classes where I say I'm a state senator and people say, oh, there's only 2 in New York State. That's an AP senior high school class in government. There is a fundamental lack of knowledge about how our government is structured. So we have many things on our plate, but I do want to say that we have the statute, we have the CFE definition, and then we have this focus on community and away from testing in order to ensure that students have a much broader range of knowledge of their responsibilities in a democracy.
Thank you, Senator. I'm struck also, I was once, for a very brief time, an adjunct at Albany. I taught intro to journalism, and one of the things that I did was, and it was a significant part of the grade, and I told them I was going to do it. You're going to have a quiz on current events once a week, and it's going to be, you know, pretty basic, and I don't care where you get your news, but you've got to read the news. Get it online, get it in the newspaper, do what you want. And I would ask them basic stuff, right? And they all knew who Serena Williams was, and they all knew what Taylor Swift was doing, and they all knew all those things. But they didn't know who the mayor of Albany was. Right. Now, they're, you know, most of them are not Albany residents. They're sort of temporarily Albany residents. They're not from Albany. But I found that pretty troubling. And I also wonder if there's a disconnect here. So, Dr. Collins, if you would, I mean, part of this seems to me to be you can tell people all that you want, young people. You can educate them and give them the information, but then making them act on it is a completely different conversation. So how do we bridge that disconnect and ensure that we're actually helping to motivate young people to take the tools that we're working to provide them with and then subsequently put that into action, particularly when it comes to voting, because we know, and I do understand, the current presidential field is perhaps a little bit, from a young person's standpoint, disappointing, but there's a whole lot of other things where the rubber hits the road. School board, you don't see young people voting in school board elections. Ostensibly, they should care a lot about that.
Well, that's an excellent question. It starts with this idea that I circulate with my students in my classes, and it's the idea that we need to treat democracy as a verb. I think we are more fixated on whether or not we are living in a democracy instead of focusing on, well, what are the acts that make us a democracy? And so that's one of the interesting things about the Civic SEAL program, is that it actually creates the conditions for there to be actions, experiential learning that set the table for democracy to be practiced as a verb. Because that's also, how kids learn. Experiential learning was one of the major sort of pedagogical developments that we've seen over the course of the last couple of decades, where kids learn by doing. It's very simple. And so what we have right now is a system where, think about it from the standpoint of driving a car. For 16 years of your life, you're never able to drive a car, and then suddenly we put you behind the wheel and say go, right? Of course you're going to be a terrible driver. Of course you might not even see the utility of driving. Like the whole concept of driving will seem useless to you. And we've been practicing democracy in the same way, where we don't have these kinds of structures in place that introduce kids to democracy in these experiential ways at early ages. And then suddenly they turn 18 and we say, well, just go out and vote, right? Get in the car. And so this is why I think these more avant-garde approaches, figuring out ways to structure the civics education experience to be built on, let's solve a problem. What's a collectively unifying problem that we see and experience as students? Okay, who do we talk to when we're confronted with this problem? What level of government must we interact with? Okay, and then from there, what are the different actions that we can take to engage with our elected officials at these different levels of government? Let's build it from experience. And again, I think that's one of the beautiful components of the Civic SEAL program, is like we can create the opportunities for democracy to be practiced as a verb.
Go, please, Commissioner.
Can I pick up on?
Yes.
Yes. So thank you for that, because sometimes we have these what I call vignettes or little stories, and they become the big story. So thank you, because the truth of the matter is that we spend a great deal of time in schools, and I would differ on the fact that, to your point, and I love the idea that you said about experiential, just like our young children come in with natural curiosity, right? So we take that natural curiosity and build on it. Unfortunately, I think sometimes there's this narrative out there, when we think about how we build the media narrative, sometimes it's on the negative point, which may be from a very slice and not the larger picture. And that takes hold versus the idea that we know as we walk into many of our schools, there's some amazing issues going on, both in the civic knowledge, in the civic skills in action, in the civic mindset, in the civic experiences. And I love the fact that you talked about the civic experiences, because what a lot of the students do, even in the younger grades, begin to think about issues of even, you talked about testing after reading a current event. Well, I think in a lot of schools, the focus given our seal of biliteracy and civic is based on looking at this issue, social, from a political participation, from accuracy, from bias, from reliability, from credibility. Those amazing skills are becoming part of making sure that our students can really zoom in and take a look at these issues, and then give voice to those issues, and then from voice give action to what they're doing in terms of many of the projects, volunteering, voting, going into communities, taking a specific project, collectively collaborating, in some cases with businesses, in some cases to address those issues, because it has an impact at a local level in their local community, and they have given voice to those issues. To the other issue about mock assembly, every year, Chancellor and I attend, and we have an incredible group of students that come up here and do a mock assembly. But those mock assemblies also happen in their own backyard. Many of the students participate and give voice to many of the issues that are very specific to the needs of those very, very communities. And many of those happen in marginalized communities because of the fact that that is a place where many, many times the voices and the issues are not heard.
I was remiss in also saying to the members of the panel that if there is something that you want to jump in on, please feel free. I feel like you do. Yeah, okay.
I do. I think it's important that we don't lose sight of the historical fact that one of the purposes of the founding of public education was to ensure that all young people could participate in meaningful ways in our democracy. That was the purpose of public education. And I think all too often, we've gotten away from that. Because part of the discussion, it's interesting, because I was listening to the discussion. This is not about taking a civics course. One course is not going to get us where we need to be. We just completed what you've probably heard, the Blue Ribbon Commission report. And one of the hallmark features of the report is the recommendation that we have a portrait of a New York City graduate, which is hugely significant because now what we're saying is let's begin with a clear picture of what we want that young person to look like at the conclusion of 12 years of education. What is the knowledge? What is the skills? What are the dispositions? What are the mindsets? And once we are clear about that, then we know what to do in school. So it's not just a course. It's not just a civics class. It's not just in 40 minutes. It's not just in a quick quiz, or it's not just in a one homework assignment. This is really about life in our democracy.
Yeah, I just want to speak to the SEAL because we've talked a lot about today, and it can feel a little abstract if you haven't lived it. In the district I was in, Holly, a small town, we were one of 50 of the first pilot districts to start this on the ground floor. And I was charged in my second year of heading up the SEAL program. We created a capstone just to give you an idea of what this looks like and why this is so crucial to have every district engage in the SEAL. So when I was still teaching, this was the hardest part about leaving the classroom for my current job is I loved this program. I put my blood, sweat, and tears into this program. Students had to identify a problem of practice that they could trace locally all the way up to the federal level. They chose their problem of practice. They had to write a 6-page thesis-based paper. They then had to create a be-informed product. Now, the goal of that product was to inform themselves through their paper and then inform the public at large, go out in the community. Now, when we started this, I told the school district, listen, we might make some good trouble, okay? Like some of these students, maybe have to be ready for this. And it did happen, but we were ready for it. After the Be Informed product, students then have to do a Take Action product, where there's a call for informed action in our community or beyond. And students went out and got internships. I work in local government as my other kind of profile, and I had students come into my town hall and work there for providing veteran services. One student organized a march on the Day of Silence in the school district. Yes, in a very conservative community. She took action, and then we have a symposium at the end where we bring in the whole community. So we can't have passive citizenship anymore, and that's what civics can sometimes turn into, is passive citizenship. That is not what we need. Sometimes that is happening, though. I think the one area we have to get better in New York is the elementary level, K through 5. The SEAL will trace 7 through 12 where you can earn points. It's 6 and below that concerns me. National Council for Social Studies in 2021 did a large study. We are averaging 9 to 28 minutes of social studies education in the elementary classroom. And that is largely because we were focusing on math and ELA because there's those tests. And I understand districts are stressed about those. And with APPR reform, there's hopefully going to be some change in Blue Ribbon. Like I said, I'm very optimistic. But if we fall into this trap of, and I think we have for the last 30 years in social studies education in this state and this country, Dr. James Lowen, Lies My Teacher Told Me, very influential book. He talks about when students learn the past and the present in social studies as a set of rote facts to be memorized, they feel that history is decided for them. The present is decided for them. It's not contingent. It's already happened. The powers that be are going to drive things, and they have no role in the story. And if we deny them at their youngest, most curious age, and deny them that time with social studies, that you do have a role in the story, you do have a part to play, and without it, we are not going to continue the system that we have. And so I'm very hopeful that we can do that at the elementary level going forward and make some changes and really get this seal K through 12 started.
I'm just curious, I'm sorry, Senator, just for one follow-up to that. What does civics education look like to a 5-year-old?
So at an elementary level? So here's a great example. First of all, what does your community look like? That's like an early question we often ask elementary folks. And New York State has provided a great K through 5 document to help educators as well that I've been working on some districts. Another great way to identify problems with like a 5th grader would be something to the effect of, you know, what are some issues you see in your community? And then let the students drive that conversation. I think another very valuable thing and a skill to do, a lot of my work focuses on bridging, finding common ground. When students have difficult conversations about anything at all, instead of when you have like a panel, instead of asking them, why do you think that way? You ask the student, why do you think you're, you know, let's say we have John and Jake, right? And they seem to disagree. John, why do you think Jake thinks that way? He has a different opinion than you. Why do you think he thinks that way? And so what you have to do in that moment is give that person, give that other student their humanity. Somebody who's different than you, you have to kind of reason through why might they think that way, what in their background. So those are some early kind of civic stuff you can do.
Senator?
Well, I just wanted to dovetail on 2 points. One, I think the point about APPR, which is the way teachers are evaluated in New York, which hopefully we're going to change this year, away from excessive reliance and reliance on testing, will allow more flexibility in spending time on these subjects. But the second thing is, I do want to say from the point of view of folks who are elected. So my colleagues, we're not only in the classroom, we do try to go to schools, but we're also talking to parents and families. And I think in our conference, there's a sense that in our stronger districts, either academically or through affluence, these subjects are out there. The parents may participate in community organizations. There may be engagement by a League of Women Voters. This was noticeable in my community. In the affluent parts of my community, the League of Women Voters was in school registering kids, 16 and 17, but in the poorer parts of my district, there's not a League of Women Voters, and they weren't in the school. So there's a greater sense, I think, and I think collectively we share this, that we want to bring all kids into this conversation and not leave communities out where there is less opportunity and less affluence. So some schools, and you're hearing about it, rural schools, where because they have someone like you know, they dive in. But we are very mindful that there are schools where nobody's sort of leading the charge. You need a social studies teacher, you need a principal, you need a person who's engaged and says this is important. So what we are trying to do is come up with creative ways, either through lawmaking, through allocation of money, through working together with SED and our colleagues to try to push this issue ahead in a collective way. We can't do it all ourselves as legislators. We don't have power over all these things. But whether it's voting, whether it's some of the new things we're doing, we hope, not everyone likes this, we're going to encourage or require a student to be on every board of trustees of a school district. I know some people in here don't want to hear that, but we are hopefully going to pass my bill to do that as a non-voting member. But we want students to sit at a board of education and realize their voice matters. They should be heard. They don't like the food, they should say so. You know, that's what they're gonna, that's fine, that's what they care about. But we are trying to push from various sort of points to move this whole conversation ahead, and with a particular focus on those communities that we feel are not doing well enough.
It seems to me also that we're talking about this in a way like student action or school action outward, how to get the students engaged in the outward community. And we're not talking a lot about community inward and how the community impacts the school and the district and the curriculum. And the reason why I bring that up is because, you know, a lot in affluent districts, teachers, parents are very involved. And they're, you know, I want my student to vote and I want my student to have all these opportunities with internships, et cetera. In less affluent communities, and perhaps also, and when I say that also, I don't think, most people think we mean communities of color. I mean rural districts, which are also, you know, in less affluent in terms of resources. In particular, how do we ensure that the parents care about civics and see the benefit of civics? Because what they care about also is, again, is my kid getting educated so my kid can be successful, so my kid can get a job, so my kid can support themselves? Like that's all, everyone cares about that, but I don't know that necessarily they're thinking, so my kid can be an active participant in the small d democratic process. That's a little bit of an abstract thought.
I'll jump in. I think there are two streams of answers to this question, to this quagmire. So, you know, I think it starts with the idea that we have an equity problem when it comes to democratic governance and civic engagement. And so, essentially, we're still playing catch up in two very important areas that are very related. We're still playing catch up, obviously, to this conversation in making civics education or access to quality civics education more equitable. But we're also playing catch up in the way in which we treat and train, the way in which we treat adult Americans as citizens. So, you know, we still have racial gaps in political participation. Those racial gaps and economic gaps exacerbate as we go lower in age group. And so this is the sign of sort of things to come. So one of the things that we have to be thinking about are like, how can we reform our structures, our democratic structures, to make sure that every adult is treated like a citizen? Because like what happens is like you create quality civics instruction happening at the school, but if you're going home to a family that has deep levels of distrust in government, if you're going home to a family that is very skeptical of the idea that government really works for them, well then the lessons that you're being taught at school about how civic participation is for you, that is being counteracted by the experiences of your parents at home. So an adult civics education program is essential, but I think this experiential approach to civics education can help mitigate that. So what we need are kids having these experiential learning moments happening at the school, these project-based experiences that bring in the parents so that the parents can also see not only that kids are learning civic content, but they're actually engaged in this process of problem solving. And it could be a way of, to use my colleague's term, bridging the civic instruction pathway from kid to parent. So at a structural level, it's up to our elected officials to ensure that our democratic structures are more accessible. But then at the educational level, it's these experiential opportunities that can create these bridging moments of civic instruction from kid to adult.
It also strikes me that there's a responsibility of government to ensure accountability of the structures that you put in place and that you hold up for kids and say, look, like civics works, government works, et cetera. And I think a perfect example is recycling. So when I was a kid, and I think we're still doing it, we push recycling like super, super hard, right? It's good for the earth, there's so much in landfills, I did huge papers on it, all these things. And, you know, kids go home to their parents and they're like, we need to recycle, we need to have 10 bins, we need to compost, we need to do all these things. And then, you know, parents are like, all right, okay, fine, we do it. And then we do it, and then, you know, the garbage truck comes and picks it up and it puts all the same stuff into the same place. And and the kids at the curb going, oh, I guess that doesn't work. Where's that going? It's all going to the same, okay. So I think that that's sort of maybe a trite example, but there is a sense of accountability that you need to make sure that what you're feeding the kids actually works, because if not, then you actually have a mistrust problem. You're only feeding that mistrust, and that's that's bad, right? That makes everything else that you try to teach, they're incredibly skeptical of. Commissioner.
Can we, you know, I guess I'm sitting here and listening to the issue of how you define the participation. Because I think, you know, when we say one group participates and the other one doesn't, I think that's kind of has a definition. And what I would say is that, for example, I don't, you know, I know that you could say, you know, maybe we have to contextualize and say, first of all, what does participation look like? And so for some people, participation may be defined in a certain way. You come out and vote or whatever. But you know what? Those things are happening even in the poorest communities. Mm-hmm. And so I think sometimes we label and we, you know, and I have to tell you, one of the frustrations sometimes in poor communities that you feel is when they are labeled as not participating, or when they're labeled as not caring, or when they're labeled that they're not doing as well as maybe, you know, Senator, to your point about wealthy communities. But you have to contextualize that. You know, some of these families have 2 or 3 jobs. Some of them, the language is a barrier. Some of them, the opportunities are barriers. Some of them, you know, there are fears because of their conditions and everything else. So I think as a society, we really have to find ways of engaging, but also knowing that they are participating in a way that maybe we don't necessarily, you know, define it as participation, but it is participation. I know, and I'm looking at, you know, the parent group. There are so many ways that they have engaged parents to participate that when you measure them or you look at them may not look like, but in fact they are. Schools have done a much better job in reaching out as to when parents can be available, you know, for families where the parents are, you know, the parent may not be working and can participate and volunteer. That could be done, you know, in a different way for parents who can, in fact, participate. So I think we also have to contextualize this and localize it and make sure that we also engage and celebrate and take our communities where they are and find the ways that we can engage them and we can bring them out, to your point, into the school and bring the school into the community. So the inward-outward conversations and activities are critical for this process.
So just to that point, there are some communities where when we talk to young people about their education, we're very quick to say to them to use their education as a way out of their community. And I think that's a huge error, huge mistake, because your education should be a way in, right? How do we flip that? And I think in some of our earlier messages to young people, and you all know what I'm talking about. We hear it every day. If you don't like what's going on in your community, get your education so you can get out. Well, that doesn't change anything. And the whole purpose of civic education is how do we encourage young people to participate in the public life of their community to make things better. That's the purpose of civic education, and that's where it begins. The other point that I would make is this. You know, our nation is a lot better than it was. I dare say that when I was a youngster going to school in Richmond, Virginia in the early 1960s, we're in a very different place than we were then. But we have a lot further to go. And I think part of what we have to do is help our young people understand that they have a role in that. They do have a role in that. The other point that I would make is this. I've been on the board now since 2008, And I've come to understand that you can't use education solutions for political problems. And I think we've got to be very careful and very clear that in the sphere of education, we have to find education solutions. You know, yes, there may be a multitude of other problems that need to be solved, but let's solve the ones that we can solve. Let's solve the ones that we have control over. And what we have control over is in the school. I'm going to veer off just for a moment, if you allow me. I don't know how many people saw 60 Minutes last week, where you had these young women in Louisiana who solved this problem. And here's what happened. In some places, they were celebrated. In other places, people said, no, they didn't do this. How could they do it? And by the way, they were celebrated all over the world. And see, part of the problem is, in our very midst is a demonstration of the excellence that we could have for everyone, and not everyone in this room knows about it. And so part of what I actually think we need is a more deliberate and intentional approach to ensure that each and every young person has the benefit of a high-quality education. And that's what is supporting and guiding our, and I'm going to come back to our Blue Ribbon Commission report, that New York has some of the best schools on the planet. The problem is they're not available to everyone. And so our challenge is, how do we ensure that more of our young people have access? And we believe a huge part of that is to ensure that civic readiness is included in that education structure.
I just want to challenge or sort of tease out one point there related to politics and education. So you can't, I think you said you can't use education to solve politics?
No,
Say it again.
I said you can't use an education solution to solve a political problem.
Right. But what happens when political problems come into the educational sphere, like who gets to use what bathroom, or who gets to read what book from the school library?
Then you call on people like the Board of Regents to address that with a policy and or regulation.
Right, and guidance, absolutely.
Or provide guidance.
We just did that this week.
I know.
I mean, you know, we do have a role, and
Yes.
obviously I'm not trying to be funny, but I think, again, that challenge and what I'm getting at is that was never going to be solved in an individual school. That was not going to be solved in a school district. When we passed the DEI policy, we knew that that wasn't going to be solved in individual districts and schools, and so we passed a policy which said very clearly, and that's what policies do, it states what your expectations are for everyone. And we said we have an expectation that this is what New York State schools and districts should do. And I think you have to start there.
Yeah. And I'll use an example. When we started down the road, I think it was Commissioner Mills 20 years ago, over 20 years ago, on the mascot issue. Because there were districts who believed that the mascots were honoring the indigenous people. Mm-hmm. The indigenous people kept saying, you're not honoring us. These images, these symbols, these mascots are insulting. But yet you want us, instead of saying to us, you know, we're telling you, you're not honoring us, but you want to believe that you are honoring us, and you want to hold on to something, your narrative about our culture, our belief system, and what these mascots represent. We set out to really help the conversation. And you know what? The students, and this is the most amazing piece, the students picked this up and started to engage in looking at the history, looking at having conversations. Our nations had conversations with us to say, how do we support educating and helping people understand that these symbols, that these mascots are not honoring. You know, you're telling them, I'm honoring you. They're telling you, no, you're not honoring us. But you want to believe that it doesn't matter what they think, it's what you want to believe. And what they were saying is, let's engage in a conversation so you, as the sender, understand it from the receiver. And that sending and receiving process, our students have done, and I celebrate this, have done a fabulous job in getting this and getting it right. And we are, at this point, we're pretty down the road of an amazing process that has taken place in this state to help people understand that the voice of the indigenous people was crystal clear. No, you're not honoring us. And our students and our communities have heard. And that we're very proud of. And
an important wrinkle in that is the Seneca, if I remember correctly, because they liked this. There's the district that most of the kids from the Seneca Nation go to. They were like, we like this. They're the Warriors, or I can't even remember it. Let's keep it. Okay, well, so that's a different conversation. But it was a conversation that needed to be had. I know.
Well, Liz, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Senator.
I'm sorry. I just want to, because I think that my colleagues, elected officials, see this problem somewhat differently than the State Education Department and the Chancellor and the Commissioner, who have their function. But we are in a world where people vote or don't vote for us or don't vote for us. And we are in a world where there's such cynicism about the political process, the electoral process, the people who are elected. And so we see it much more as a continuum. We recognize schools can't solve every problem, but we are dealing with kids who are being educated by their parents to think that politics is corrupt. The government doesn't help anybody. No one speaks to our problems. And that is the culture that we are trying as elected officials in my conference and on the issues that we've been involved with to try to confront more globally than just what happens in a school. For us, a school is not isolated. A school is, whether it's a community school that the unions have supported and we support, where parents and families are involved, or whether it's kids in a school who are doing a community-based project as part of their, either in Seal of Civic Readiness or beyond, as you've described. The kids are out in the community dealing with who's paying a fair wage to restaurant workers. We think these things are very integrated. We are worried, much more worried about this dominant cynicism about our democracy that parents and kids share. If you talk to high school students who are not top of their class, not only do they think politics is corrupt and bad, but they're really not very interested. And we are trying to sort of come up with creative ways to deal with that. And I don't think we can leave that out of the conversation. Because it's not like it was, when some of us who are old were in school. My father ran for office. You asked what you could do. In second grade, I stood up and told my class about running for the state senate, because my father did. He lost. But, my point is, there was a sense, somebody ran for office, that was good, that was interesting, he must believe in something. That we're losing that. And that's what we, as people who are voted on, or people who say it doesn't matter, we're very worried that the next generation is going to take that cynicism.
I can still sing the I'm Just a Bill song, just for the record. Mr. Verno, I know you wanted to weigh in.
Yeah, I want to go back to the classroom and the students, kind of from what we've been talking about. When you mentioned that point of what happens when politics spills into the educational space, that's something that in my district, that when I was teaching and in my current role with BOCES, working with over 22 districts, that gets talked about a lot. Very conservative districts, so what do we do about that? And a lot of my work and research is involved in this idea of political bridging. If finding common ground. I spoke at an iCivics panel a few weeks ago during Civic Learning Week about bridging and the work that I do. There is a bill, so I'm going to start at the top and I want to take it to the student level. There's a bill right now called the Building Civic Bridges Act that is at the federal level, sponsored by, I believe it's Congressman Kilmer from Washington, that would provide funding, that would provide teacher training to educators to learn how to bridge in communities, their students, and across even just the adults in the building. Bridging work has to start with the adults, really. Great book if you want to go learn about this is Learning to Depolarize by Kent Lindsay. He and I work very closely together, and we're bringing him to, we're bringing him to BOCES to have teachers come see him, because schools can be the place where we can depolarize. And that doesn't mean we agree. I think that's been talked about in the last panel especially, but just that we can disagree better. And what bridging does for the students is I've had to get creative with how I try to convince schools to engage in more civic stuff. And one of these creative ways is, look, civics doesn't have to be one more thing, it can be intertwined. So media literacy, which is a big push in schools, social emotional learning, very, very crucial, and then civics. So what bridging does is it takes those things and it intertwines them with students. And they can have these conversations. If you go look at things like the perception gap, it's on morelikeus.org, right? How we're not as divided as we think we are. So what it'll ask you to do is put what your beliefs are and then rate what you think, the majority of the other party is. And what you will see is that we are not nearly as divided as our media and other outlets would have you think we are. And so, the center talked about decline in institutional trust. I've got a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, which means my wife is at home exhausted because I've been in Albany for 2 days. But I'm worried about the future. Benjamin Franklin said, "A republic if you can keep it," supposedly, as he left the Constitution Convention, right? We don't know if he actually said that, but that rings true when I look at those kids when I leave the house every day. And that the decline in institutional trust that we have and the decline in just social capital of talking to our neighbor really frightens me for what our kids are headed for. And I think schools can be the place through bridging to fix that.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just think when it comes to the politics issue, I think it gets misinterpreted a bit, because what we're seeing in reference now to your question was about more of like this emerging culture war. But the issue, in truth, like, there have always been cultural contestation around education. That's nothing new. Like, that's one of the complexities of education, is that we're trying to have this compulsory system that has to set academic goals, but also be respectful of the different sort of cultural values that kids and families bring into the classrooms. We've been trying to figure out that right, healthy mix since we've had compulsory schooling. The difference now is that it's being politicized by political parties who have a very different interest and stake in education. And so now it is up to our state leaders to sort of rebuff against the new sort of political contestation. The thing that also makes that, I guess, unfortunate is that it masks what's been going on with education, especially pre-pandemic, which was the fact that we actually had been making a lot of progress. If you look at NAEP scores going into 2019, we had seen some of the biggest gains across social, economic, and racial groups that we had seen in decades. We were on the verge of really catapulting into a new level of academic progress. And then the pandemic happens, of course, and now we've seen all the learning loss that takes place. And now, because of the culture war, we're not even talking about the learning loss. We're not talking about the fact that the average kid lost, I think it's 5 months of instruction in math and 4 months of instruction in reading. So it's pretty much half of an academic year gone as a result. And this is the average kid, so we haven't even started to break down the disparities. That should have been the conversation. Instead, we're having conversations about these more political issues. Now, take this conversation to civics. One, we underassess civics, period, over time. But if you look at NAEP scores in civics, we have made literally no progress in civics student achievement in about 25 years. So the average NAEP score in 1998 was 150 on this sort of NAEP score range. What is it in 2022? Literally 150. Zero progress. And so this needs to be the conversation that we're having, not only in this room, but of course nationally and state by state, and especially across the state of New York. And this is why what we've been doing is just not enough. We have so much, we've made a lot of progress, but we have a lot more work to do.
So I think when in the time that we have remaining, we should speak a little bit to the practicality of the approach that we would employ, because I don't know if you've read the article in the New Yorker related to attention span, which is alarming for not young people only, but for everyone. This has made us all dumb. So, you know, it's a problem. And then the question, I mean, and I think there's a couple of aspects to this. One is media literacy, right? And, you know, what am I looking at? AI is certainly changing that significantly, because I might be looking at something and thinking it's real and it's actually not, because it's generated by a computer and maybe it was generated by a bot in Russia, or who knows, and why. There's also the question related to education and definitions of certain terms, and again, not to get too political, but what does genocide mean? It seems to mean something different from whatever side of this particular debate that you stand on. And then, you know, once you get into the media literacy question, you also get into the how are we going to teach this to people who are just simply, maybe at home it's reinforced that they're disinterested, but also maybe they just don't have the attention span to pay attention to what we're saying, and how do we shift our approach to address that? That's more of like a treatise and not a question necessarily, but maybe people could react to that. Do you want to start, Senator?
No, as someone who's not a teacher, and I think one interesting thing, which is not directly relevant, is whether schools should ban cell phones. And I think a number of schools that I visited have, and I assume some of the ones you have too, and I think your point is well taken about that. But I think, you know, there are these other issues like media literacy, financial literacy, you know, we in the legislature have lots of bills to require all this stuff, and I think people understand that we veer away from that. We view that as the prerogative of local districts with guidance from the state education department, which works very hard to provide good materials. But I think our challenge is we try to find the places where we do have authority and we can get bills passed, and they tend to be in these sort of around the edges area as opposed to directly in the school, where we believe that our jurisdiction is somewhat circumscribed by the existence of our structure with the regents and the fact that we need bills to be signed by the governor's office.
Well, then there's a historic tension there, too.
Yes, there certainly is.
And we won't go, we'll delve too deeply into the political, so I'll just leave that part aside. Go ahead.
But I'll jump in really quickly on digital media literacy, because that's a focus that we've had at the Center for Educational Equity. And you know, one of the things that is critical in this work is understanding the importance of training kids to identify misinformation. You know, you spoke earlier about how kids would know more about like Taylor Swift and Venus or Serena Williams than some of the work of who their elected officials are. But what's happening is that kids are becoming more and more likely to be exposed not only to information that distracts them from civic knowledge, but actually incorrect civic knowledge. And so having kids being able to judiciously consume news information, discern what is right, what is wrong, what is accurate, what has actually been vetted, what is an actual legitimate source, especially as our media industry, our news media industry, has been under attack for the past few years. And so with news media having its legitimacy question, with kids being distracted when they open their cell phones, the idea of digital media literacy is more important now than ever before.
I think it's also important to educate kids, and I have a stepson who's 16, and it's almost impossible. I mean, this is designed to feel good, right? This is designed to make you stay. This is designed to encourage you, to sell you things. I mean, it's a business. It's designed to influence you and, you know, mind control you to some degree, get you to do things, right? And it's collecting all of your data and then selling all of your data, et cetera. And when I mentioned that in passing to him, he's like, okay, like, all right, never mind. Like, I can't get you to care about that. That's just the way that we all live now, right? We all just, okay, my data's out there. Yeah, that's sort of just like a cost of doing business, which, and I don't even know how to start climbing up that mountain, or even if it's even surmountable.
I can kind of speak to that. Yeah, so I left the classroom in the fall of this past year, and yeah, the phones are a challenge. There's no easy way to put that. The phones are challenging, students enjoy them, it feels good, you know, you raised all those points, but this is where I become hopeful, because some of the things that we are doing with performance-based assessment and the recommendations in the Bluebird Commission, if those are followed through on, will allow for far more inquiry, far more space in the classroom, and above all else, I challenge students when we had the capstone project at my district to, you say that school does not afford you the time to investigate what you are interested in. Because I guarantee there's a civic window into what you're interested in. There always is. Civics is in everything we do when we wake up in the morning. This is the time to put your money where your mouth is as young people. You say you're misunderstood. You say, you know, and they take it and run with it. And sometimes you just got to have them use that phone as a tool rather than a distraction. So I had, you know, and this is another aspect that I think is going to come in for the future, is we need really solid professional development for educators to meet the challenges of the phone, to meet the challenges of civics, to meet the challenge of inequities in our communities. That, you know, districts are busy right now. The sub shortage, the teacher shortage is very difficult. How we, you know, whatever pathway we have teachers take, whether it's a master's degree, whether it's training from BOCES, national certification, no matter what that pathway is, we've got to have solid training for teachers to put the best ones in front of students, because the kids are all right. One of the greatest themes of history is that there's always something wrong with the kids. The kids are all right. They have passions, they have beliefs. We just have to give them the space and the time and show them the civic gateway through what they are interested in to allow them to attack the problems.
The one thing I would say that challenges that is also that parents want the kids to have the phone for safety.
Yeah.
You know, with all the issues, you know, they just feel that, God forbid, if something happened, I can get in touch. So that's an issue that obviously creates that tension. The other thing is that I will tell you, I also see the modeling issues that are going on. For example, how many of us go into a restaurant and you see 2 people, 4 people, whatever, and they're on their phones as they're enjoying dinner? How many times, you know, even looking around this room, people are using their phones at the same time that they're listening to this lecture? How many times you're in a meeting and you're having what I would call a real interesting conversation, and people are still, you know, going through what I would call, you know, they consider multitasking. So how do you, you know, in terms of lack of modeling, how do you say to young people when mom and dad and others, and this is what they're seeing, that as they're, you know, they're watching the way that people are interacting, it seems, I mean, I've even seen it where 2 people are having a conversation and at the same time somebody, and you sort of say to yourself, oh my God, like seriously, you're engaging, oh yeah, oh, of course, yes. And you say to yourself, oh my God, we really have, you know, taking it to a whole new different level. And we are so unaware of it at this point that we are, I mean, as I was watching around this room, I'm not kidding you, I was watching some people like really just, and I said to myself, you know what? And these are people that are sometimes in the kinds of situations where people are watching them, and students are watching them, other people are watching them, and so I think we almost have to think about the sense of you know, the honoring that interaction, honoring that listening. You know, when young people say, you're not listening to me, you know what? In some cases, we're not. We're half listening to them. So I do think that we really have to make a concerted effort to think about that exchange of situations. You know, and I'm sure all of you have had the whole situation with, you know, the young student says, you know, or your child says, Mom, and you're hearing, no, oh yeah, sure. Mom, I'm gonna put my head in the oven. Oh yeah, go ahead, not a problem. You know, you sort of, because you're really not listening. We think we are, but we're not. The other thing I would say, the other thing I would say is that I think that one of the key issues that I often think about is how do we create safe spaces for these conversations to take place, and we really need to keep that at the heart of this situation. Creating these safe spaces for these conversations to take place is part of, I think, the core of our work in schools, number one. Number two, I think having them, civility is important, respectfully disagreeing is important, looking at different viewpoints. I mean, I see even in our government where that civility is not modeled. And so our young people say, well, if this person can treat, a person who's presenting as a bully, then I guess that's perfectly okay. And I also do think that we have to go back to helping our students analyze, evaluate, news literacy from accuracy, bias, reliability, and credibility. I really think that we really need to keep that as part of the conversation.
So the commissioner is like doing a good job at sort of segueing into what I think is a wrap up of final thoughts. But it strikes me that I know the people in this room, well, first of all, they argue all the time in a space that requires you to be civil, or the judge admonishes you and you don't get to stick around. So that is, I think, an interesting sort of side note to this conversation. But as you sort of wrap up your final thoughts, and I do want to leave just a few minutes for questions, please maybe think about how the legal community might also be helpful in addressing this problem, aside from the president who has brought us together to have this conversation, which is really important, and the people who are doing the work in this space. What more can individuals who are lawyers and judges, et cetera, do to help? Do you want to start? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just jump in because I don't think many people know that this year I fought for and got $500,000 in the state budget for basically a public policy institute at SUNY Buffalo Law School, the only public law school other than the City College, for there to be a place where law students are encouraged to go into state policy, state government, to be counsels to agencies, because I have found in my years here, including as counsel to the Senate Democrats previously in my career, that very few law students thought of this as a place that is worthy of their time and interest. And I think both that's misguided professionally and also for lawyers, we need to encourage lawyering in this space and for people to come and have some of the opportunities to participate here and to respectfully disagree, which I agree. I think we all sense this lack of civility pervasive in our big politics and in our schools, and obviously we see it right now all over the place. So to the question of what lawyers can do, I think there's quite a bit, and the Bar Association does quite a bit in schools, and there's more we can do. I am very interested in working with all of our law schools, and I've had preliminary conversations about the City College Law School also participating in this effort to bring law students and lawyers into state government, to find it to be an attractive place to come. And I believe it is. And so that sort of was something that I fought hard for, and with the help of Majority Leader Stuart Cousins, I was able to get in the budget. So hopefully next year we can come back and report something real has happened as a result of that.
Go ahead.
This is not a recommendation, but it's something that keeps me up at night. We've talked about how cynicism, what that does to individuals, what it does to young people, what it does to adults, and it makes us very distrusting, and when the environment is not predictable, it just creates stress for everyone. Well, we understand that. But I think the challenge right now is, do we truly have the will to ensure that every young person and I'll confine it to New York State's public schools, is the beneficiary of a quality education. That, to me, is the bottom line. I think the real question becomes, what can we do? How do we use our combined knowledge to make that a reality? This is what parents want. Parents have an expectation that their neighborhood school is going to work. If their neighborhood school doesn't work, it helps if they're able to get their child into a different school. But when that happens, what does that say to that parent and their child about their community, about their neighborhood? And so it is important for all of us who are in powerful positions to think about, well, what is the vision of public education in New York State? You know, do we truly will to ensure that every youngster in every neighborhood has access to whatever they need to have a quality education? That, to me, is the issue. That's what we ought to be using our knowledge and skills, and I would welcome an opportunity to talk to anyone, attorneys, other educators, higher educators, because I think, you know, it's no longer the purview of just teachers and principals and superintendents. You know, education is important. You know, education matters, right? It still matters. You know, and when you think about the discussions, and I'm sorry, when you think right now, there are a lot of discussions, and people are actually saying things like, well, they don't need to go to college. Mm-hmm. And then you ask yourself, but there's some data here. There's information that suggests that your ability to penetrate the middle class is directly related to the amount of education that you have. So what are we now saying? And so for me, the question becomes, how do we see the vision and the values of America was really about all. And I think where we are challenged is we haven't quite come to that. And so how do we realize that vision and value? We can't do it unless we all focus and very deliberate.
Dr. Collins?
Following the Chancellor's comments is extremely difficult, so I don't even know what to say. That was so powerful and profound. What I will say is that I think we should also be thinking about how the legal community could be helpful in ensuring that we treat civic education as a skill-based field. Right? There's a lack of dignity that's given to it in that sense. We treat math as a skill-based area. We treat reading and writing areas as skill-based areas, and we treat civics as something that kids should maybe have exposure to, but not something to where they're developing real skills that could translate in the workforce and in their lives. And I think it's the opposite in the sense that, like, you could argue that civic skills are the most important, and that civic skills could actually be gateways to developing these other skills. And so I think, you know, restructuring and having a sort of rethink civics as skill-based learning, and I think there's a particular role that the legal community can play here. Because, like, for instance, I didn't even know what a lawyer did until I was, like, in college. It's like, I knew it was a very well-respected profession, but, like, what do you do? And then, like, ultimately you learn that, well, the majority of the lawmakers in our country, I think, like, what, 97% of lawmakers is some crazy stat, are lawyers. And, well, why are lawyers so likely to become lawmakers? Well, a big part of making laws is being very precise about language. And it's actually the use of language that we use to build institutions. Like, our government is basically a language that has been actualized. And so, like, bringing these kinds of skills to kids, how would they build an institution if they had to decide how to self-govern in a way that maybe is very low stakes? How can they start to develop these skills of institution building, of institution redesign, of institutional reform, of making our democracy work better for them on their terms? I think, like, these are skills that could be practiced and developed, integrated into curricula, and we could start these things much earlier.
And you could start it even as what's expected in how we self-govern our classroom. These are the ways that we expect that we're going to talk to one another. We're going to raise our hand. We're not going to interrupt one another. We do it in the office. This is how we're going to talk to one another. These are the rules of our office. We self-determine that this office is going to operate this way, and we're not going to stand for this, this, and this, et cetera. I'm giving Mr. DeMuro the last word because I made him go first. So.
I think that's going to be also equally hard to follow. I could listen to you talk all day, Professor. Are we going to commit to the great task before us that has been there the whole time and really throw our weight behind civic education? As far as the law community, the number one thing I think of is that it's the one branch of the three that is the most misunderstood, I think, by the citizenry, especially students. What does that judicial branch do again? You know, you can see them get through the executive and legislative, like, what do they do again? And yet, I think they're the most engaged in it. I always tell them, the courts, that is the one area of our branches that really can have a massive impact on your time here in school. I used to teach a lesson, do you really have freedom in school? We go through Tinker, we go through all these Supreme Court cases. And students really get into the narrative of those cases. So that's one way that I think the law community that is engaging them and can continue to engage them is through those court cases. Students really enjoy that. I want to just end with the last thought of the Douglas speech, which was mentioned earlier. Living just on the west side of Rochester, New York, that speech has great meaning to me. Reading Douglas throughout my whole life, a guy that I'm just so passionate about. And that speech is a speech that I think every American should read and really dig into it, because in his story too, Douglas was a guy who did not think the Constitution and the founding documents of this country were something that could be used to end slavery. He started out relatively radical. And then later in his, as the election of Lincoln approaches, as the war approaches, he begins to see the tools, the saving principles that we have as the weapon to create equality and to end the great sin and stain of slavery in this country. And that's an optimistic story that maybe not everybody feels, but I think through better civic education, we can begin to see the foundations, the institutions we have, and restore that trust with our students.
We might have time for like one question. Sorry. Please, go ahead. Or loud, or really loud. Oh, so yes, Mike, sorry.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mirna Santiago, and I'm the founder and CEO of an organization called Girls Rule the Law. And we do actually teach middle and high school girls about the law, the legal field, the legislature, and the judiciary. In part, how to run for office, but also just to how to enter into those fields. So I have two thoughts leading up to a question. The first thought is that I'm a little bit concerned that trying to implement a civics certification or a civics curriculum, just that, is a Band-Aid on a bullet wound, right? Just because they are, and some of you alluded to it, I think Renee alluded to it, several people alluded to the fact that we have a segregation problem, not just in New York, but throughout the United States. In fact, 72% of all neighborhoods are still segregated. So for a lot of the kids that we're telling them, hey, get excited about the civics program, get excited about the government, but they're not seeing a government that is inclusive to them, where they're not seeing a government that people have their lived experiences. It's a little tough to get excited when you're dealing with segregation and failing schools and crime and noise and a food desert and all this other stuff, overemployment by your parents just to put food on the table, 2 or 3 jobs, and you're telling them, well, we have school choice. You can go to a school in Manhattan. Well, how am I going to get there? How are my parents going to take me there when they're working 2 or 3 jobs? So that's my concern. That was my one thought about that. The other thing is that we're gutting so many other programs, right? We're gutting affirmative action. We defeated the Common Core movement, which would have done, I think what Dr. Young talked about, is allowing kids throughout the state to have the same skill set so that they can actually go to college or go into life prepared, which we don't have. It was defeated. So now you do have all of these different curriculums throughout the state, and you have kids who, schools that are really separate and unequal. And I can talk about this from experience because a lot of my work is with the inner city kids in the Bronx, in Brooklyn, and Harlem. And when you see them and you compare them to the schools like in Putnam County and Westchester County, it's completely different. The setting is different, the green spaces are different, what's available to the kids are different, and then you're telling the kids, well, if you do civics program, you can tell us, what you need. Well, I need stuff that you can't provide through a civics program. So how do you, I guess that's my question, how do we make sure that it's not performative, that it's actually inspiring, and that it's going to give these kids the tools that they need to actually effectuate change within the next 10, 15 years when they actually can vote, when they actually can run for office? That's my question.
I could try to speak to yeah. I could try to speak to a little bit of that as far as the seal of civic readiness. New York State has the handbook for the seal of civic readiness, but it allows extreme amounts of local control. And that stresses some districts out because as somebody that had to implement a program, I always, when a school district comes to me in my job now and says, we want to do a seal program, how do we do it? Most of the communities that I work with are very impoverished and rural. And so how do we do this with limited resources, things of that nature? I say, New York State has this great handbook of ideas, but just keep it between the buoys. What are the problems in your community to help empower students? There's a lot of local control. That can be a good thing or a bad thing, is your kind of question stated, but you raise great points. But I guess I could speak to that one element of that. Those communities you spoke about, when they create their SEAL programs, have a lot of control what it looks like and what they want to do. It's not so much like, here's the SEAL program from the top, what's important to your community instead is the way they approach it. So I could speak to that point from a lower level at least. Any
other final thoughts from the panel?
Sure. Well, having, I often use for the audience Betty from the Bronx. So I'm gonna speak from like Betty from the Bronx. Having grown up in the Bronx when, Fort Apache, the Bronx is burning, buildings that still, to your point, look like nobody in this room would ever send their children to, okay? It is so challenging, not just the segregation part, but I think there is a statement that we make about certain communities, and we make them by the buildings that the children go into, the way that they enter those communities, because we tell the kids immediately having to go through, check-ins, right? We tell them we don't trust you, we've got to check you, and that starts the school day, right? And we also talk about the way we classify and the way we talk about these communities as much failure. And that oppression and that failure is internalized. So that's just even at the starting point. But I'm going to go back to the hope and what we're trying to do, which is to really invest, and truly try to create. As the Chancellor said, both of us often think about what are the elements, what are the ways, what do we value in our society, and what are the ways that we can advance, and if nothing else, really point out that there are these inequities, and equity matters. And so civic equity, if I can put it in that label, is critical. If we are going to move forward, we really have to be honest and really put the language out there to definitely understand that there are teacher equity issues, there are building equity issues, there are ways that we treat certain communities that really, truly, we would not treat other communities. So we have to start with the honesty of what those things are, and then we have to think about what are the investments and the actions that we take to truly lift those communities and to ensure that, back to the comment about if all means all, then we really have to make those investments.
That's right. And if I could, I would just add, it's also in the narrative. It's kind of like how you tell the story. This is not the first time we've been challenged by poverty. I would imagine that there are those in this audience that have had some interaction with poverty, but you're here. And I think the commissioner's right that there's also the element of hope. And I believe that it is our responsibility to do what we know works and what has been done before. Because what we're not talking about creating a new pedagogy or discovering new theories. I actually think we know how to educate our children right now. I think the challenge is, are our children's education the priority? And that is a conversation that we need to have. So for me, to succumb to this idea that concentrated poverty and the challenges that go with it are insurmountable, see, that really flies in the face of the thousands of young people right now who live in those same communities, who are graduating from those schools and going on to some of the top universities of this nation and making enormous contributions. And so it just seems to me that it's all in how we talk about it, and it's all in how we work together to solve it. The other point that I would make is this. I actually think we spend too much time focused on failure. I attend lots of conferences and meetings, and we all know what's wrong. I mean, we can go out, ask anyone on any corner, tell me what's wrong, and they can tell you. But ask them what's right. Ask them where are the strengths. Ask them where are the indicators of what I just said, that there are young people that are attending these schools. There are schools all over New York State that have the same demographics that some associate with failure, but are successful. And so we ought to be talking about those schools. We ought to be identifying those schools. We ought to be thinking through, well, what are those higher education K-12 partnerships that are actually in existence today that are working to benefit all young people? So for me, it's really a question of concentration, and it's a question, someone used the word earlier, courage. I actually think it's about having the courage to do the right thing.
We are almost over. I mean, we're over time for sure, but I don't want to cut you off, Senator, and if you want to. Senator?
No. I'm fine.
Okay.
Let's end on courage.
I want to thank you all for being here and for such a lively and insightful discussion. I appreciate it, and I appreciate the opportunity to participate on short notice. And I'll turn it over to the president, and he'll just give a few words and then send you off to lunch.
Great to hear you. Phenomenal. Yeah, love to hear you.
So, first of all, this was fabulous, and I really appreciate all of you being here, and I especially appreciate Liz coming in at sort of the last minute and filling in. We're going to break for lunch.